Yeah, so we are starting the program of the inaugural lecture. On behalf of the audience, the new batch of students, the batch that has just passed out, resource persons and well-wishers who've joined in person and online, I would like to welcome you all for this inaugural lecture by Professor Jan Kregel. I'm grateful, we are grateful to Professor Kregel to have accepted our request. Professor Kregel will speak on is there a post-Keynesian approach to development economics? Professor Kregel's lecture will last for a few minutes, about an hour or so, a little less, and then we will have a Q&A. Professor Kregel will take questions from the audience. So on your behalf, may I request Professor Kregel to start his lecture? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And we will try and get all of the technical matters straightened out here. We're going to present a very quick summary. Is everything working fine, Jim?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so let's go to the presentation right away. Okay, everybody can see the
Yes.
splash screen, so we can start. Okay, the topic which I chose today was one that has both a, so we say, a current application and also as a historical range. As most of you may know, I started out my career as an economist some years ago, I will not tell you how many, when the idea of a post-Keynesian economics was very popular. Post-Keynesian economics was considered or was debated for several years, and in general, the approach which I had always supported was that this was an attempt to take the results of what at that time we called the Keynesian revolution and to apply them more generally to the problems of economic theory and economic policy. Now, within that particular post-Keynesian approach, it was quite clear that for most people interested in economic development, post-Keynesian theory seemed to have a very direct application for industrialized economies, but it was not particularly clear that the results of Keynes' theory had direct application for developing countries. So if you look at the way in which Keynes' theory was presented in the period, and we're now talking about the 1960s and the 1970s, we can quite simply say that the presumption was that we were looking at cyclical changes in income and employment, and that the problem to be faced was a decline in employment and output and in terms of capacity utilization. So that in particular, you looked at the ability to use an increase in demand, and we'll leave aside just exactly how we were going to do that, an increase in demand to increase capacity utilization. And the example that we always used to give is that if you have an automobile factory, the automobile factory is there. If aggregate demand falls, then capacity utilization in the factory goes down to, say, 50 or 60%. You produce unemployment by firing the excess workers. And the problem was to increase the demand for the output and to generate an increase in demand for employment for those unemployed workers. Now, the idea was that basically you were doing this by means of an impact on prices and an impact on the financing for domestic investment. And usually at this stage, people talked about deficit financing. Keynes himself, we find, that was not so enamored of public deficit financing, but in fact was willing to countenance that as one possible way. Now, the formal mechanism was an increase in employment and income via the idea of the multiplier. And the difficulty is that for many developing economies, the idea of the multiplier seemed very suspicious. And the argument that was often given is that if incomes are close to subsistence, if you look at your multiplier formula, you require a savings propensity that is greater than zero in order for the multiplier to function. And many development economists argued that if you were looking at an economy at extremely low income levels with extremely low savings ratios, that the multiplier simply would not be a very high value and indeed might not even function. And this is something which called into question the use of Keynesian theories. At the same time, the kinds of policy tools which I've mentioned were usually monetary and fiscal policy, attempts to have an impact on national incomes and on prices, was also suspect because most developing countries didn't have developed financial markets in order to operate normal monetary policy, and most of them simply did not have very well developed government budgetary policies. And again, we're thinking now, as I mentioned, in the period of the 1960s, and the period of the 1960s was one in which the majority of developing countries were in Africa and Asia, and they were in fact newly democratized former colonies, which were simply building up their national governments and their nation states, so that there was a great deal of skepticism. On the other hand, if we look at what I call Keynes' Cambridge disciples and a number of economists who were working at Oxford on the basis of Keynes' theory, we find that they were very active in the analysis of economic development. And much of what I'm going to be talking about today will come from a series of papers which are publicly available, one by Joan Robinson called Notes on Economic Development, one by Austin Robinson, Economic Development of Malthussia, Richard Kahn, The Pace of Development, and Nicholas Calder, a number of papers which are published in his collections of essays. Now, the interesting point is that all of these economists not only wrote extensively on development in their published work, they participated in the analysis of planning programs, which were formulated by many of these countries, and in addition, visited these countries very frequently. Those of you in India are aware that Joan Robinson very frequently spent her term holidays in India, and she and Austin spent a good deal of time before she became an active Cambridge economist working in England. Nicholas Calder was an advisor to CEPAL for many years, working with Furtado and Prebisch, and was an active consultant for tax policies for most developing countries. I used to have a joke that I used to tell. For a short time, Nicholas Calder was my supervisor when I was a student in Cambridge, and I used to joke that I saw Nicky more frequently in Heathrow Airport than I saw him in Cambridge, because he was consistently moving back and forth, providing advice to developing countries. So the next item is the Oxford Institute of Economics and Statistics, where Thomas Balog, Koleski, Schumacher, Steindl, and Mandelbaum were all working, and were all actively working to develop or apply the results of the Keynesian revolution to problems of development. So, in fact, you have this paradox in one sense, that it seems that Keynes' theory would have very little application to the problems of developing countries, but at the same time, those people who were directly involved with the elaboration of Keynes' theory were actively looking at its impact on economic development. Now, down at the bottom, you'll see I've listed good references. There's a very nice paper by John Toy, who I worked with when he was working with us in UNCTAD in Geneva, article called The Influence of Keynes on Development Economics, which is an excellent summary of many of these contributions, and a book edited by Tony Thirlwall from one of the Keynes conferences that were held by him at his university called Keynes and Economic Development. And in that book, you can see a number of articles, and in particular, both Richard Kahn and Nicholas Kaldor were present at those conferences. So they give you a written background that will supplement as the presentation that I'm going to make. Now, going back again to the idea of the actual economists who were working in the areas of development, there were many prominent development economists who really didn't see any use in the Keynesian theory in resolving the problems of economic development. Prebisch, in particular, wrote a very nice book on the general theory, but in fact did not believe that the problems of development were linked to Keynesian problems of unemployment, but rather placed most of his stress on this idea of the terms of trade, the tendential decline, secular decline in the terms of trade of the primary commodities produced by developing countries. V.K.R.V. Rao was, and we will say this now, a famous Indian economist, and not only a famous Indian economist within the Indian academic community, but also in the United Nations, and held several top-level posts in the General Secretariat in New York, in the United Nations, and was an active author in dealing with development problems. Celso Furtado, a famous Brazilian economist who worked with Prebisch at CIPAL, made the very simple point, referring to the Northeast in Brazil, which was primarily an economy in which the labor force was imported and was not part of the formal labor market. And he made the simple point that the multiplier is going to be zero if wages are simply of subsistence. Samir Amin, someone who took great care in analyzing the problems of African economies, made the point that since the colonizers in African countries were dominant in terms of generating expenditures, and since most of those expenditures were on imported luxury products from the European economies, that the leakage of demand through the deficit on the balance of payments would be so great as, again, to reduce the multiplier to levels which are very, very low, and making it difficult to use simple Keynesian expenditure policies in order to generate development. The last name I've put down is Myrdal. Myrdal, in fact, was not ever what we would call a Keynesian disciple. Myrdal has his own background as a monetary economist developing the work of Excel, but in general, producing this idea which came from his work in analyzing racial relationships in the United States, and then development of using the idea of cumulative causation. That is the idea that markets do not equilibrate, but that markets in fact depart from equilibrium. That is, there are internal forces. So again, this is an argument against this very simple idea of the equilibrium process, which is a process of generating income towards an equilibrium level. So in general, you have again this contradiction in which even those economists who would consider themselves as development economists were not very enamored of the fact that that would work. Now, if you look at the just taking as an example the critical summary that exists in one of the famous papers by Rao, he points out that if the Keynesian multiplier principle is going to work, that you must have the following conditions. Number one, you have to have involuntary unemployment. What does that mean? That means that people have been employed and are currently out of employment. that you have an industrial economy, the supply curve of output slopes upwards towards the right, but not become vertical, so that there is some supply elasticity. You have excess capacity in consumption goods industries and comparative elastic supply of working capital required for increased output. And quite simply said, these assumptions do not hold in the case of an underdeveloped economy. Okay, and I'm quoting directly from his paper. Involuntary unemployment of the Keynesian type is necessarily associated with free enterprise wage economy, where the majority of earners work for wages and where production is much more for exchange than for self-consumption. Okay, so this is Rao's more or less rejection of the of Keynesian theory. Now, if we look, and I'm going to start now with the analysis presented by Keynes' closest disciples, Richard Kahn. Richard Kahn, in the article which I've referenced, Pace of Development, does not directly deal with this problem of the multiplier. Okay, so the point which I'm trying to make here is most of the criticism came from the idea of government spending via the multiplier producing increases in income, and took a completely different tack, but a tack which is closely associated with the kinds of growth and distribution theory that these economists developed after the general theory. And again, we're talking about the theories that were set up in the 1950s and 1960s. What Kahn does is to say, really, what the problem in analyzing the problem of development, we have to first make a decision as to whether or not your theoretical basis is going to be one which is based on time preference or one that is based on liquidity preference. Now, we know what is liquidity preference, and Kahn's paper is primarily attacking the use of time preference as the basis for development theory, which was very, very popular in this post-war period. So he starts out by asking the question, are you assuming full employment? Okay, and I can, on a personal basis, okay, confirm that Richard always started out an analysis in this way, that is, in terms of one of these conferences that Tirwal organized, which I attended very frequently. Kahn would always stand up, and the first thing he would ask of somebody giving a presentation, he would say, are you implicitly assuming full employment, or is the economy subject to unemployed labor? Okay, now, the argument he makes is, he said, if you're assuming full employment, implicitly what you're doing is adopting the theories that are associated with Irving Fisher. Irving Fisher is the economist who applied this idea of time preference. And the time preference theory is what? Well, the time preference theory is simply to identify the optimal allocation of consumption over time. Or if you put it in simple terms, it's a question of how much you consume relative to what you're going to invest for future consumption. And implicitly, Kahn argues that if you're doing this, you're assuming that the system is already at full employment. So you're simply looking at casting this in different terms, is that your decision to consume today is also a decision to save for investment and to consume for the future. Okay. Now, in this particular approach, savings determines investment, and that supports growth and development. So what Kahn is arguing is that if you adopt the time preference view, savings becomes the binding constraint on development, so that you're always looking at the development process as one which requires an adjustment of time preference. That is, to increase your preference for future income relative to present income, to increase present saving relative to present demand. Okay? If we go back, Adam Smith very clearly said that any individual who decided not to consume today would be crazy not to invest what he didn't consume for what he called future enjoyment. So the argument then is developed in terms of your theory of supporting the increase in income and employment in developing countries, because you assume that most of these countries have very low or subsistence incomes, that they will also have low savings rates. So that the normal solution that emerges is that since developing countries do not have a capacity to save sufficiently in order to generate investment, to expand future growth, that the solution is going to be foreign saving, that is, borrowing from developed countries. And of course, the implication of this is what? The implication is that if you are borrowing from developed countries, we know how the accounts work for trade and payments. A current account deficit is always going to result when you are borrowing capital from abroad, so that you end up with a development strategy which is always based on developed countries having current account surpluses and developed countries having current account surpluses and developing countries having current account deficits, so that you, in a sense, are borrowing your investments from abroad. And this is the basic point. And as you can see here, Kahn is not making any reference to the multiplier, whether it works or not. He's simply saying that implicitly, if you adopt the idea that you are using time preference for your development strategy, that development strategy is always going to be based on trying to increase domestic saving, and it's going to be based on supplementing domestic savings by borrowing from abroad. Now, if we look today, as I said, we're looking at also current applications of these theories. We can see that the basic problems that have been facing developing countries since the 1960s has been what? The existence of debt crises and unsustainable external debt burdens. So where is this coming from? Well, Kahn is explaining to us is that if you have adopted the time preference theory, this is a natural result. Now, this was also the position which was promoted by most developing economists in this post-war period. And this is a quotation from a 1947 piece by Jacob Weiner. The basic argument for international investment of capital is that under normal conditions, it results in the movement of capital from countries in which its marginal value productivity is low to countries in which its marginal value productivity is high, and that it thus tends towards an equalization of marginal value productivity of capital throughout the world, and consequently towards a maximum contribution of the world's capital resources to world production and income. So the idea is that all you need is a free international capital market, free international capital flows, and the result of this will be for these funds to automatically flow from developed to developing countries, because the return to capital is higher in developing countries. At the same time, it then maximizes, as we said, it produces this result of automatically producing what came to be called convergence. That is, convergence between the development of the developing and the developed world, because, as Weiner tells us, that this will produce the maximum contribution of the world's capital resources. This is the best of all possible worlds. Now, the first point at which the Cambridge growth and distribution theory have an impact on this theory is in terms of looking at, as we say, the implicit assumptions and conclusions that are producing Weiner's position. And that is a capital scarcity in developing countries producing a high rate of return, a surplus in developed countries having a lower rate of return. Global investors raise returns by investing in developing countries. It's a natural market process. Developing countries develop more rapidly by borrowing capital from developed countries, and the global rate of growth form of wealth formation is maximized. Now, the difficulty is that as a result of the Cambridge capital theory debates, there's no theoretical support for this assumption on capital flows. It's impossible to establish an inverse relation between capital scarcity and rate of return. It's not even possible to measure capital scarcity. Those of you who are familiar with Joan Robinson's criticism of abuse of capital in the production function, and the production function, as we know, is one of the basic elements upon which neoclassical development theory is based, so that you end up with a position, and this is a position which was held by all of those development economists who rejected the multiplier, did argue that when effective demand is low in a country, that profitability also will be low. Profitability is not determined by capital scarcity. Profitability instead is primarily determined by the level of domestic demand. And this is where the Keynesian theory then comes back. And this is something you find in the theories of Nurkse, you find them in the theories of Rosenstein-Rodin, you find them in the theories of almost all of what we call the pioneers of development. Now, if you then look at Kahn's formal contribution, he said that if you start out with the idea that you do have unemployed labor, and this is one of the basic elements that you have in developing countries, he said, I want to take as my basis a proposition which is so obvious that it seems sometimes to be overlooked. It is simply this. In principle, there is no reason why under these conditions, that is of surplus labor, a higher rate of investment need necessitate a lower aggregate of consumption as it would if labor were scarce. Okay, what is he telling us? He's saying, look, you don't need to save more if you have surplus labor. What is now involved is principally a redistribution of consumption between different classes of the community and not a reduction in the total. Okay, now, as I said, this is a point which is normally overlooked. That is, we talk about always the idea of increasing savings or increasing demand. What Kahn here is telling us is that we have misstated the problem of increasing development resources if we simply divide those resources into consumption and savings. Okay, what he's saying is that if we can redistribute consumption between different classes of the community and not reduce consumption, and again, keep in the back of your mind that every time he's talking about change in consumption, he's talking about a change in the savings rates. So first, it's a distribution between employed and unemployed workers. Okay, employed workers enjoy consumption. Unemployed workers don't. If you expand employment, he says, the question is, how are you going to distribute the increase in income that you get from employing more workers between increasing real consumption of the employed and increasing the real consumption of the unemployed? Okay. The second is the distribution between wages and profits. If you have an increase in overall employment, is this going to increase profits or is it going to increase wages? And what you should be looking at is the distribution between those two. And the bottom line is that he's going to come out and he's going to say, in general, increasing development provides an increase in private profitability. And in fact, instead of the government looking to via the multiplier increase demand, the better thing to do would be to increase savings out of profits so that you bring about a change in that distribution of income. And finally, we're going to talk about a distribution of income between private and public consumption. And this is the normal idea of whether or not government should be responsible for financing. Now, Rao had the same idea as Kahn, and this would not be surprising because, as we know, Rao was a student of both Robinson and Kahn in Cambridge. Kahn notes that the factors introduced by the existence of peasant proprietors and of a surplus of rural population are fundamental to the problems of a typical underdeveloped country, but they need not affect the main course of my argument at this stage. Okay, this is Kahn saying that I'm talking about unemployed labor. I recognize that most of that unemployed labor is going to be in terms of peasant labor, agricultural and rural population. But I'm going to deal now simply with this distribution problem. Before we go and deal with that, we're going to take a sidetrack and note that this is a point that Rao did develop extensively on the basis of a principle that was produced by John Robinson. Okay, underdeveloped, and this is a quotation from the Rao article that I had presented previously. Underdeveloped economies are conspicuous for the extent to which they contain disguised unemployment. Only the kind of disguised unemployment they have is not of the type visualized by Mrs. Robinson, where it results from a decline in effective demand and can exist in an industrial economy. In an underdeveloped and agrarian economy with little capital equipment or somewhat low state of technical knowledge like India, on the other hand, disguised unemployment is a normal feature of the economy. The term is not applied, as Mrs. Robinson does, to wage labor taking to less productive work on account of employment. It is applied in the case of India to persons who are employed in the sense that they are engaged in household enterprise, but who are really in a state of disguised unemployment, in the sense that no difference will be made to output by the withdrawal from the occupations concerned. And then he goes on to cite the UN Committee on Experts, in which he was a contributor. Now, what is this business of disguised unemployment? Why is it important, and where does it come from? Well, John Robinson developed this as an attempt to provide a gauge of the appropriate support of aggregate demand by government expenditure policy. Okay. Now, if we look at normal discussions of fiscal policy, we normally look at the percentage of unemployed. So when the rate of unemployment goes to 2% or 3% or 4%, people say we're nearing full employment. We should stop supporting the economy. Why? Well, the presumption is that we will probably end up with inflation. Okay. Now, Keynes himself believed that the appropriate place to change the focus of government expenditure policies was in the range of 6 to 7%. Okay. Now, John Robinson objects to this way of defining when the economy is full employment. And in doing that, she develops this idea of disguised unemployment. And the basis of the idea of the disguised unemployment is similar to the one that Richard Kahn has used. And her argument is, how can we bring about an increase in investment without reducing consumption of the entire economy? Okay. Now, this is, again, this framing, the same framing that Kahn has used. What we're talking about is the ability to bring about, as Kahn says, a redistribution in the side of consumption. So Robinson puts the point like this. She said, if it is the case that you can increase investment, the increase in investment provides for an increase in employment, and the increase in investment good output also generates an increase in consumption good output, then clearly the economy was not at full employment. Okay, so again, what you're saying is that you managed to increase the growth rate, you managed to increase investment without increasing savings, and you managed to do it at the same time as expanding unemployment. Now, what allows you to do this? And John Robinson created this idea of disguised unemployment to explain how that could happen. Now, what is disguised unemployment? Well, quite simply, if you go to New York City at virtually any period of time, from the time I started living in the area, if you went into a taxi cab, you would find a taxi driver who was an immigrant and who had high technical qualifications. You would find architects, you would find engineers, you would find chemists driving taxis. Now, her argument is that the productivity of labor of somebody driving a taxi is probably much lower than it is when the person who is driving a taxi is playing the role or employed as an engineer. If you increase demand, and by increasing demand, you manage to draw out employment, that is, the engineers stop driving taxis and get employment in construction companies, the overall productivity of the economy is going to increase. That overall increase in productivity is available to do what? It's available to provide not only the support for the new investment, but support for the consumption, okay, of newly employed workers. So that the increase in employment by drawing workers out of disguised unemployment into formal employment provides an increase in productivity and an overall increase in output. And it's a question of how that increase in output is shared between consumption and investment. And she argues that if it can be used to increase both consumption and investment, then by definition, the economy was not at full employment, and the government should continue to expand demand until you are in a position in which you can no longer provide an increase in investment and consumption at the same time. And it's at that point you reach full employment. And when you reach full employment, you're back to this trade-off between consumption and investment. Now, if we think of this idea of disguised unemployment, and we now think of the Lewis explanation of development with unlimited supplies of labor, basically development is based in those theories in terms of what? Not by transferring taxi drivers from being driving taxis to being engineers, but by transferring the peasant agricultural population that has low productivity to manufacturing where productivity is higher. And we have this standard theory that is used by the neoclassical theorists, that you have negative marginal product of labor in agriculture and in the peasant economies. And simply by moving labor out of agriculture into manufacturing, you end up with an increase in national income. You end up with support for development. And in general, all of these problems, development problems, are then the idea of transferring disguised unemployment labor into higher productivity occupations. Okay, so this is basically, if you look, again, one of these post-Keynesian contributions to development theory. Virtually all of development theory based on the idea of emphasizing manufacturing as a higher productivity level of activity comes from the fact that it was generated by Rao's development of the idea of disguised unemployment. Now, if we go back to Kahn, as we said, we started out that argument by Kahn saying, I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about something else, which is very similar. Now, this is probably very sensible because we know Joan Robinson and Richard Kahn collaborated and discussed these issues very frequently. So it's highly probable that Kahn said, okay, Joan, you do this disguised unemployment business. I'm going to do something else. The same principle, but in a different way. And he does that by making the distinction between underemployment and what he calls imperfect employment. Okay? And the basic difference is that if you look at the social relative to the private gains that come from this transfer of unemployed workers from unemployment or underemployment and from what he calls imperfect employment, there is a difference, okay? And he said, under a system in which each member of the family shares the fruit of the family's toil, so long as he lives and works with them, but ceases to receive his share, if he leaves the family holding, the incentive to the individual to seek work elsewhere is unlikely to reflect the full economic benefit which the family and society generally would derive derived from his diversion to more productive work. Okay, this is the key point. The economic benefit is measured roughly by the excess of the wage in industry over the marginal product in agriculture. Okay, so he's saying this is the standard. If you look at the Lewis argument, if you look at the standard neoclassical theory, the economic benefit you get is the wage in industry is 100. The marginal product at agriculture is 0 or minus. So you get the full economic benefit. But he says the private incentive is measured roughly by the excess of the industrial wage over the agricultural average product. Okay, the average product. Why? Well, the average product, you go back to the argument about the family. When you leave the family, okay, what you've done is you've reduced, okay, the amount of consumption by the average products that the worker used to have. And in that case, you end up with the family getting an increase, okay, in its average level of consumption. So again, you're having this transfer. The transfer provides an increase in the private output, but it also comes with an increase or without an increase in saving by the family in which the worker who is transferred had been a member. So the agricultural marginal product under conditions of overpopulation tends to be very low indeed, and he says can be 0 or negative. The idea of imperfect employment can be applied also to those middleman activities which yield a smaller social than private gain. Okay, now this distinction, again, the reason I'm bringing this up, this is something which is not in general been applied. And what Kahn does is to use this to say, okay, this is fine, this idea that you end up with an increase in saving as the result of the difference between the manufacturing wage and the negative marginal product. But he said, but if we analyze this very carefully, these conclusions require qualification. The marginal product should, however, be estimated after profit allowance has been made for the stimulating effect on agricultural efficiency of a withdrawal of surplus manpower, a factor which in itself will tend towards a low marginal product. Okay, so he's saying we have to take into account that productivity in agriculture is not given. As a result of this shift, there's going to be an impact on output in the agricultural sector. Allowance also has to be made for the social cost involved in providing new dwellings and other services for immigrants into the towns. The standard of living amongst peasant proprietors tends for 3 separate reasons to benefit from a high rate of development. And where there is a landlord, he will absorb some or most of this benefit. Okay, so he's saying, okay, we have this increase in productivity. Where is it going to go? And how are we going to be able to use it in order to support increased investment? He said, first, there's a change in the terms of trade between the countryside and the manufacturing sector. Okay, an improvement in the terms of trade increases income in agriculture. And what does this mean? Well, it means quite simply is that impetus, which is supposed to come from pushing labor out of agriculture, in fact, there is a counter argument. And that counter argument is that conditions in agriculture may be getting better. Second, there is a favorable effect on agricultural efficiency of development in agriculture itself. This is the productivity element. And thirdly, there is the effect of restraint resulting with withdrawal of the labor into the towns on the number of people who have to share the produce of any particular area of land. To some extent, a rise in rural standard of living is properly regarded as highly desirable, even though it operates at the expense of the growth of industrial employment and at the expense, therefore, of the alleviation of rural overpopulation. So he's saying, there are 2 forces here. One counter the other. You have one which is a benefit to the economy as a whole. This is for the move to manufacturing. And the other is the benefit of the rural populations, which make it less attractive to move out of agriculture into manufacturing. The important thing is that any such rise should be purposive and not accidental, and that it should be limited to the minimum which appears essential. He then goes on to say that in general, if you have landlords in the system, all of these benefits to agriculture are going to go where? They're going to go to the landlords. And this is the bottom line. The obvious mechanism to employ to restrain the rise in the rural standard of living is a land tax. And the land tax is an attempt to do what? Is to appropriate that increase in productivity. Okay, if you think of it this way, manufacturing is increasing productivity because we're transferring labor and expanding manufacturing. But at the same time, there's an increase in productivity in agriculture, in the rural agents. And the way to appropriate that, and this is again, how do we distribute? Remember, we started out by saying we're looking to distribute across different types of employment, is to have a land tax on the landlords to appropriate the profitability. Okay, now again, summary, I took as my basic proposition that it is possible to organize a higher rate of investment without thereby physically necessitating a lower aggregate of consumption, so that the economic problem is one of redistributing consumption rather than enforcing a net overall reduction. Again, this is the point against the neoclassical theory that says you have to save more. If there's some elasticity of supply, a higher rate of investment will, by raising demand, lead to a higher output of consumption goods and therefore to a greater aggregate consumption. The consumption of those who benefit will increase by more than the reduction of the consumption of those who suffer. My argument is then imbued with a fortiori force. Instead of dealing with a limiting case to which Keynes may be thought by some to have little to contribute, we are now dealing with the case of Keynesian unemployment, which differs from the conventional case only in the degree of inelasticity of the supply curves. Okay, the only really acceptable reason for foregoing the development of the additional output of consumption goods, which a higher rate of investment would entail, would be the unwillingness of those who are anyhow fully employed to accept a lower increase in the standard of living. Okay, so again, this is the basic principle that we're pushing. It's not that the multiplier is the thing which causes the increase in income and causes the increase in savings and investment. Here we're saying that as long as you're able to redistribute those increases that do not require a reduction in consumption, you can provide an increase in the overall standard of living by arranging things so that the increase in productivity lead to both an increase in consumption and an increase in investment. And this is, of course, the basic principle which came out of this argument of the application of disguised unemployment. Okay. So bottom line, the remedy is in determining the future course of the rate of investment to have regard to standards of living of the mass of the workers rather than of real earnings per head. And again, he's now criticizing, he's saying, you're simply not going to allow real incomes to increase by the rate of productivity. What you're going to do is to share those productivity increases across the currently employed and those who are moving out of agriculture or moving out of employment. And it's that margin, that generated margin, which allows you to provide for an increase in development, investment for development without having to reduce the consumption of any particular class in the system. So if we look again now to finish up this part of the argument, back to Joan Robinson. Joan Robinson in her articles said very clearly, the importance of Keynes' theory was to shift the emphasis from the rentier aspect of capitalism as a product of thrift to the entrepreneur aspect of capital as the product of enterprise. According to him, the development of wealth depends not upon prudence, but upon energy. And this is a quotation from Keynes about animal spirits. The enemy of accumulation is not lack of thriftiness, but lack of energy. If the animal spirits flag, the economy will fall into stagnation, and thriftiness, far from helping to revive them, makes it still worse by reducing the profitable market for production. It then becomes the duty of governments to substitute public investment for failing activity of the private entrepreneur. In such a case, society is faced with the choice between consuming and saving. An increase in the rate of investment would be accompanied by an increase in consumption. An economy which is suffering from a deficiency of effective demand is unable to use the productive equipment and the labor force which is already in existence and eager to work if only it is given the chance. Investment and consumption, therefore, are not alternatives. Okay? You don't have to save or consume. You can have both. And it is not a question of sacrificing present consumption to add to future wealth. The very process of adding faster to wealth by speeding up investment will lead to more consumption being enjoyed, whereas to refrain from consumption would not promote investment, but only increase unemployment. Now, the last point that we want to make, and I'm going to finish up here, she goes on to say that if you look at Keynes' theory, well, put it a different way, you look at Keynes' criticism of existing development theory, she says that there is a paradox here. And that paradox is the fact that as soon as Keynes' views became orthodox doctrine, a large part of them ceased to be relevant. Okay? Now, in Keynes' short period theory, an increase in saving reduces demand and leads to unemployment. Okay? So you don't want to save. It's a bad thing. But once it is accepted policy that full employment is to be maintained, in any case, the whole problem appears in a different light. First, the fruit of investment becomes more important than the process of investment. And digging holes or building battleships is seen in its true light as an onerous burden on the community, not as a source of wealth. If resources are not being used for these dismal purposes, they could be used for something useful or pleasant. Secondly, the place of saving in the scheme of things is completely altered. The choice between present consumption and accumulation for the future becomes a real one. Investment involves a present sacrifice instead of being a vehicle for increasing present benefit. Public and private virtue once more come together, and refraining from consumption individually means increasing wealth collectively. Okay? So again, you have this change in terms of the way you view the system and its ability to grow once you're presuming that you're always at full employment. And she says this leads to the position, and if you look, the basic result is that savings becomes a virtue. Okay? The problem of distribution of the product of industry comes back into the center of the argument. Okay? And this is, as I mentioned before, this is the application of the Keynesian theories of growth and distribution, which were developed on the basis of Keynes' general theory. So that when you find someone like Redistribution, okay, Redistribution says you have to save. Okay, savings is the source of economic development. And John Robinson is saying, yes, this is absolutely true on, or following Kahn, also on the assumption that you are going to be fully employing all your available labor. And it's only in that case that we can argue that savings becomes the advantage, or it becomes the source of increasing investment, because you're producing your maximum possibility. Okay, there was a lot more stuff that I have prepared, but I think this is an appropriate time to stop, because it provides us with this very simple point that it's not really the multiplier, which is the argument that we're looking at here. The argument is, as Kahn said, the way you distribute the gains that you get from development across the different classes of the different.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Kregel.
Okay, now. There we go. Stop.
Yeah.
There we go.
So now the floor is open for questions. Those online, please raise your hands and we will let you ask your questions, make a comment one by one. And those person also please raise your hands. Is there anyone here in the classroom? There's one hand here. Let's wait for those online, and if I don't see any hands online, then we can start with the question here. Okay. Maria has raised her hand, so we'll start with Maria. Yeah, Maria, please unmute and ask your question or make a comment. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation. It was great presentation. I really enjoyed it. I was wondering about I'm coming from Argentina, and in Latin America, we have one of the worst Gini in the land access. It's completely unequal. And I was wondering, it's very hard in terms of politically speaking to tax, the landlords, the latifundia. But that's something that it has been very promoted, for example, like even by the US, in Japan, in South Korea, and in these kind of cases, land reform also helped to the development. So I was wondering, what is sometimes the political economy of this kind of policies, and how we can think about how this land structure and the absolute lack of taxes of landlords also reinforce, for example, like the underdevelopment in Latin America.
Okay, do you want me to answer one by one, or do you want to accumulate?
It's up to you. Would you like to collect a few questions? Yeah.
For me, it's the same.
Okay, so then please respond to this, and then we can take the next one.
Now, one thing which I didn't get to measure, I mentioned Nicholas Kaldor as being an advisor to developing countries. Kaldor was primarily an advisor on taxation, and this was also part of the Cambridge myth, is that every time Nicky had visited a country, you ended up with a riot as soon as he left, because he was always promoting increased taxation. And part of the presentation which I was trying to give is to help us understand why you had Keynesian economists who did this. Okay, and I think the presentation from John Robinson at the end tries to deal with that particular problem, because increase in taxation is an attempt to increase public saving. So it's back to that issue between public and private investment. In the case of Richard Kahn, and this is also in general, one of the interesting points behind all of these post-Keynesian analysis of economic development, it is always based on what we would call microtheory. Okay, now microtheory in the sense of what? The microtheory in the sense of elasticities, demand elasticities, production elasticities, supply elasticities. And you'll notice that I went through part of Kahn's presentation. There is this argument about the ability of the system to expand. You need a supply elasticity if that increase in consumption is going to lead to real income. Now, one of the difficulties that you have in terms of land tenure, and this is why Kahn's argument, what did I say, sort of counter argument against the Lewis hypothesis of transferring labor, is precisely in terms of the institutional formation of land ownership. Okay, so obviously you come from Argentina, you're familiar with the structural arguments about inflation in Latin American developing countries. And that argument goes simply as follows. If you take the hacienda, latifundia, and you have the landowner Okay, these things are what we would call basically self-sufficient entities. Okay, so you're producing everything you need to consume. So you can say they're not quite non-market entities because they depend on the market to sell output, but they produce more or less everything they need internally. So if you ask the question, what happens if there's an increase in demand for their product so that you get an increase in price? Kahn comes along and says, well, let's look at the elasticity first. And what is the elasticity? Well, if you're a landowner and say you're a large producer of grains, you're selling grains at a higher price. Okay. Domestically, internally to your domestic unit, nothing is changed. You're simply accumulating, okay, more claims on the rest of the world, which basically you don't need. And in general, the argument is what? The argument is the standard structuralist argument is that the normal price response mechanism, which would depend on a very high price elasticity, simply isn't there because of the structure of land ownership, so that you don't get the kind of response that you need. So the obvious argument is what? And this is where Nicky always got into trouble. He said, well, what you want to do is to change the incentives by imposing a tax. And you impose the tax, okay, in order to create the kinds of market incentives that the economic structure doesn't allow and doesn't produce. And of course, this leads to tremendous political problems, and it leads the ability of the government then to decide how it's going to appropriate that increase in productivity, which does come or is a potential. Okay, so in case of the large hacienda, and you get this very large improvement, and we see this through the period of the last 50 to 20 years. You've had very large increases in the terms of trade, very large increases in incomes, and those very large increases in incomes to the proprietors, what have they done to increase employment? Almost nothing. What have they done to increase domestic wages? Almost nothing. So what you're saying is that, and this is what Kahn is saying, well, what you need to do is to find a mechanism to appropriate those gains without having to disappropriate the owners, because that's the question that takes place at the political level. And well, I don't know, you're from Argentina, so I don't have to explain the problem you have between the campo and the rest of the world. So yeah, no, it's a very good question. And it's always that good. Now, put it this way, it's not the question that the resources aren't there, okay, in order to provide an overall increase. And this is, again, when Kahn was talking about this difference between imperfect employment and underemployment, the difference between the private benefit and the social benefit of that increase. The question is, how is that benefit distributed? And his argument is, number one, the benefit should go to the recently unemployed workers first, rather than the employed workers. Okay, and this is also a difficult political question. Okay, you try to do that in Argentina, you have unions, and the unions are going to do what? The unions are going to defend the employed workers relative to the cartoneros. Okay, so that's the first political problem. The second one is then between the wages profit distribution. And these are all, as I say, political questions. But the point is, and the basic point behind this is that no, you don't have to have people saving more and consuming less just in order to live better. You can always live better by having an economic policy that allows everybody to benefit.
Thank you. Any other hands raised online? We have a question here in the classroom. Shri Kumar. Use this.
Thank you, Professor. It's been a very good explanation. How you like link the class dynamics with the post-Keynesian approach. But I was thinking in this way, if we take it in a global level, where the capital is coming from outside, like countries like India, which does not have enough developed infrastructural facilities to utilize the capacity that can increase the employment and other aspect. Like even we need social expenditures on health and education that will increase our labor productivity and the quality of human capital also. But the capital itself is coming from outside our countries, which does not use the kind of social, does not let it does not let even governments are restricted by these capitals that could use that efficiently the social expenditure and infrastructural development to enhance our employment and expenditure demand. Could create demand and all these. Whereas the European countries, they already have have enough infrastructural development. So how could we fight with the how can we fight with the global capitalist hegemony, capital hegemony? That's all.
Okay, this is, as I say, another aspect of the problem. If we step back, again, basically, if you think of what the kind of argument that Kahn and Robinson are doing, is saying that the market is leaving unexploited gains because they have a policy that focuses on the wrong variable. Okay, savings doesn't increase, but expenditure does. Okay, so you're trying to get those unexploited gains, and the argument you're making is that savings doesn't limit investment. Right now, if you go back and you pick up Schumpeter, and Schumpeter tells us what? Schumpeter tells us that, well, look, the bankers can manage to create as much money as they want, and they can finance as much investment as they want without any constraints. Now, this is also an argument, a similar argument to the ones that have been made here, that there is no constraint, there's no real constraint, savings constraint, and there's no financial constraint on increasing investment. Okay, and this is why, if you look at the difference between the Schumpeterian, if you like, the Schumpeterian approach and the Keynesian approach says, I use the multiplier to show you that savings is always going to increase in order to balance the amount of investment. So savings cannot be a constraint on investment. What Schumpeter says is, I'm going to show you the financial system, and the financial system can create as much money as it wants to finance the investment, so that the investment cannot be constrained by saving. And after you make the investment, then the standard argument comes in. So the problem that you have when the next step from the argument about foreign saving is to say, really, it's not the fact that you're borrowing foreign saving. What you're doing is you're importing a foreign financial system in order to generate the finance for investment. Okay? And one of the things which is notable about the entire development literature, starting in the starting with Rosenstein-Rodin in 1940 and then after the war, is that amongst those, what I call the pioneers of development theory, hardly any of them make reference to the mechanism, the institutional mechanism of financing for development. Okay, they make the formal theoretical argument that you can do something, but they don't tell you how to do it. Rosenstein-Rodin is the only one who does that, That is, he talks about setting up a European investment trust, and he talks about the arguments of diversification, and he's the first to propose PPPs, public-private partnerships, and things of that sort. Okay, but he is the only person who does this. And well, I shouldn't say only, because I'm not absolutely sure of that, but he's the only one I've been able to find who has a formal proposal. And even then, he says, well, I'm not going to go into details on this. I'm simply saying that we're going to require a domestic financial system, a domestic financial mechanism, in order to allow for the financing of this. So if you take Joan Robinson's argument, and she's saying, once we recognize that you need full employment, savings becomes important, you have this very crucial problem, which is, how do you transform domestic savings into investment? What is the financial mechanism? Okay, and that's the second piece of the Keynesian argument. If you remember the general theory says you have two things that you have to determine. The first thing you have to determine is how much you consume and how much you save. And the second thing you have to determine is how you are going to hold your savings. And that's the financial system. And that's the piece which is missing. So that what the neoclassical theory says is that, well, don't worry about that, because all the savings are in the developed countries, and the developed countries have all of the financial institutions to do that. We're going to let the foreign financial institutions take care of the financing. And when we do that, what happens? When we do that, we generate foreign claims on our increase in national income and national output, which we have to repay. And this is the point at which, well, those of you who are familiar with my use of the Domar argument, my argument has always been, with the backing of MC Domar, who you cannot question, that the only way that foreign borrowing allows you to undertake a net transfer of resources from the developed countries is that what? The interest rates, okay, that you're paying have to be below the increase in the rate of growth of national income that is generated by investing those funds. And this virtually never happens. It virtually never happens. Why? Basically because of the risk premia, which are attached to developed country borrowing. And Domar is very clear. If you go and read his original article, he said, well, everybody talks about this business of savings and investment and everything else. What you should be doing is focusing on the interest rates. And if you get the interest rates, the borrowing rates down low enough, then it becomes a viable proposition to borrow in international markets. But those conditions are hardly ever maintained. So if we go back, well, I don't know, the discussion that we had with Argentina, if we look at Argentina now, international borrowing, they're borrowing at what? Something like 2,000 basis points above international averages, okay? So this means by definition, anything that Argentina borrows is going to cost them in terms of real income and in terms of real growth.
Thank you. Do we have any raised online? Shall
Okay. Evan sent me a note. There's a very, if you look at the handbook on development theory, there's a piece on, I have in there called the effective demand approach to economic development or something like that. It's a reference to well, it's not the most famous Domar paper, but it's the same one. It's the same argument that he used in terms of analyzing domestic borrowing, and which is, Eric, help me. Who are the editors of this book? It was you and Jayati and who else? I can't remember. Can't remember now who it was, but
Eric is muted. Eric, you need to
Eric. Okay.
Sorry. We have a couple of books on that, but one in 2016 and one in 2023. So I don't know which one you're referring to, but
I think it's in 2016. I can't remember. One or the other. But
okay. Well, then it's alternative theories of economic development. It happens to be here on the shelf.
happens to be in the, it's probably that one.
Yeah, it's edited by Jayati Ghosh, Rainer Kattel, and myself. And Elgar, Handbook of Alternative Theories of Economic Development. So that's the Jan's chapter there.
Thank you. Are there any comments, questions that we need to deal with here in the classroom? Is this anybody with a question?
Hi, Professor.
Fiona, please go ahead.
Thank you so
Okay.
much. I have a question. Thank you so much, Prof, for a very great presentation. Really learned a lot from that session. I am interested, and I'm not sure whether it's relevant to this lecture, but interested in the activities that happen outside the Keynesian theory, economic theory, especially activities such as like caring that's being provided by women at home. So like giving birth. These are economic, they contribute to the formal economic space, but how are they classified in this approach? And also like activities in communities, especially in the global south, where we have communities that organize themselves to do like cooperatives or to participate in an economic activity, but those sort of activities that happen are not classified as an economic activity, however, in a formal economic system. I hope I'm clear on that. Yeah, that's my question. Thanks, and over.
Yeah. Okay. The area in which I have some personal knowledge and expertise are the local programs which were used in Argentina after the crisis at the beginning of the 2000s, the programs which were the Jefes programs, in which you had a rather unique combination of government support and local organization in terms of providing, basically in terms of the crisis, the idea was providing a floor on household incomes, so that the government provided, first of all, what was called, we called it now a job guarantee program. So everybody who was part of a program received income, and you received an income as part of what you could call a cooperative or a local employment. Now, these were set up not only in terms of the government providing the transfers, but to a large extent providing the inputs to the production activities that the particular programs undertook. So that the important thing here was that it was not a position in which the government said, okay, you're going to do this. But the government said, if your cooperative or your community sets up a program in which you offer to do this, we're going to provide, number one, a minimum income for the people who work in those programs, and we're also going to provide resources in order to implement those programs. So, for example, in the beginning, you had very simple things like soup kitchens. so that you had the possibility of going to work in the program soup kitchen for what was a very low income, but it did provide that basic minimum. Now, if you start with a soup kitchen, okay, if you're a mother, you have children, and it's difficult to work in a soup kitchen if you have children who have to be taken care of. So that the next thing is that aside from the soup kitchen, you end up with a nursery. So you have something there where families can have a safe place to allow their children to play and to be taken care of while they're working in the program. So the most advanced programs, you started to have some which started into construction activities. That is, you have unemployed construction workers. Unemployed construction workers don't have anything to do, but they don't have bricks. So the government said, okay, we're going to provide you with the bricks, and they would then build actual structures. Then you would find, well, if you have a soup kitchen, you need something to make the soup. How do you make the soup? Well, you need a garden. So the government would provide support to set up a community garden. And you would then go from the community garden to the soup kitchen, to the nursery, to the construction activities. And then the government didn't discover, but it became obvious that these people who were benefiting from the program, in general, okay, did not have formal access to education. So that the education department would then provide a mobile teaching force, so that the teachers would, instead of sitting in a school in the center, they would go around and provide instruction. Okay, and this then developed into part of the formal occupation. A formal occupation was attending a class to learn and read and write. Okay, and I personally sat in to some of the sessions where you had mothers who had children who had no jobs and were incapable of finding employment because they did not have the technical qualifications. So we would sit there in the classroom, and the teachers would come around and do the teaching. Okay, so this is the best example that I know. There are a number of these programs that existed at other places. The one, as I say, the one in Argentina, I had personal involvement and was able to see how these things worked. And the important point, as I said, was this combination that you had between the involvement of the various, the ministries that were involved, the labor ministry, the education industry, and the technology industry were all involved in the program, but they were not involved in the program in terms of running the program. The programs were all formulated and run at the local level. And well, it's a very long story, because there was already a certain amount of infrastructure that existed in terms of support programs that dated back from the time when there was a very, very large movement of population from the rural areas into the cities. And so you had already, when the crisis hit, you had a substantial amount of urban unemployment that existed and was being serviced by charitable organizations and things like this. But that's the best alternative that I can borrow. And in this particular case, it is something that is discussed now in terms of the difference between these, what we call job support programs or job guarantee programs, and basic income transfers. Now, from the point of view of governments, basic income transfers are always much easier. All right. For example, Brazil has used Bolsa Familia, has used the basic transfer programs. The difficulty is that the basic transfer programs are simply floor programs, and results that we have in terms of analyzing the impact of the basic income programs is you discover, yes, they do improve conditions. They do improve the financial balances of households, but in general, they don't tend to provide an increase in the kinds of services that unemployed and poor families require in order to become active participants in the economy. So again, one of the arguments since we were particularly involved in the ones around Buenos Aires and in Lomas de Zamora. In the end, you had the local representatives of the Ministry of Labor were providing courses for writing up CVs for people who wanted to actually go into the formal labor market. And then there was also a group in where was it, Engineer Buje or something like that, where you had the groups of women who got together and in fact produced the local plumbing, because these were basically undeveloped areas in which there were zero government services. So you had one of the formal plans was in particular a women's group who actually provided the sanitation and the water supply services to particular areas of the economy. So that there are alternatives in which this can take place, but these are sort of, I say, this is well beyond this idea of government deficit spending. These are programs which do require a great deal of cooperation between the central government or the provincial governments and the local population. I don't know. Maria, if you're still there, maybe you can.
Yeah, thank you very much for all the knowledge about Argentina. It's very impressive. Well, now the situation in Argentina is way more complex, I would say, with the new government. So they are cutting all the budgets for these programs in most of the cases, but it's very interesting. Also in the 2001 crisis, for the one that doesn't know very much, it's like all the financial system in Argentina crashed in 2001. So even if you have money in the bank, you couldn't get the money because all the financial really crashed. So it was something very interesting. Also, like some movements, some workers took the factories and started running the factories. So they are still some of the factories are still operating. So they created this kind of knowledge as well about how to auto manage the factories by workers, and even in very specific or advanced sector like pharmaceuticals or metal machinery, industrial sector. So that's something also very interesting that Argentina has kind of kept ongoing, even though nowadays is way more complex. I'm not sure how it's going to finish this with this new anarcho-capitalism.
One thing I forgot to mention, Fiona, in terms of the provision, one of the basic contributions of these programs was usually to provide healthcare services to families, which were not normally provided by government provision. So that this was also an important element of the program. And it's very difficult. We talk about this in terms of job guarantees, but in fact, what was provided to the program was actually sort of a community service where the central government or the regional governments were not able to provide the services because the financing was not available. The government financing was not available.
Thank you. We will have one last question before we close for the day. There's a hand raised by Adil online. Adil, can you please unmute and pose your question? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, sir. One of the slides you presented aroused critical summary and about the Keynesian model. It works under certain assumptions, and they did not hold in underdeveloped countries. But mostly we say that in underdeveloped countries, we have adopted the models of developed world, and we mostly see them, they fail. But then how we will tackle the problem of underdevelopment?
Okay, the transmission was not particularly good, and I'm not sure I understood precisely what the question was.
Yeah, I'm saying that in one of your slides, you presented Rao's critical summary, where he says that the assumptions under which Keynesian model holds they are not present within the underdeveloped world. But mostly we have seen in the backdrop of the development economics or the development economists, they present developed models of developed world for the underdeveloped economies. So we see that they are unsuccessful for most of the times. Then how we can use the Keynesian theory within the developing or underdeveloped world?
Okay. The point that Rao was making, and the point that I was making at the beginning, was that most of the presentation and the emphasis was on the concept of the multiplier. Now, as I've already indicated, the multiplier is really not an essential piece of Keynesian theory. And that's why I used the articles of Richard Kahn and Joan Robinson, because in terms of their analysis, they don't make the case for deficit spending. They don't make the case for using the argument of the multiplier to counter the necessity of increasing savings to increase investment. They used a very different application. Now, that different explanation is part of what I would call post-Keynesian theory. In sometime in the 1970s, I wrote a book where I tried to spell out the formal application of what is basically a two-sector model, similar to the one that you find in Marx's Capital, of how that system can be achieved. And all Kahn and Robinson are doing is taking that two-sector model and asking the question, if you want to increase the investment sector in order to increase the growth rate, is it necessary to increase savings and reduce consumption in order to do that? And their answer is no. That is, there are these unexploited potential gains in productivity, which would allow you to increase both investment and consumption at the same time, so that your development process is not constrained by saving. And in order to meet your development objectives, you don't have to introduce IMF austerity plans in order to reduce consumption and presume that somehow or other that reduction in the demand for consumption goods is automatically going to be transferred into increased expenditure on investment goods. And the simple argument is, and we said, this is the one about profitability. That is, if you're reducing the expenditure, the demand for domestic output of consumption goods, it means that the profit margins on domestic consumption production will go down, so that the incentive to expand productive capacity to increase investment is automatically reduced, which is just the opposite, which you want to do. So that the mistaken application of the theories would be simply to say, all I have to do is to increase the government deficit and automatically this is going to create growth. No, that's not going to happen. And as Richard Kahn made very clear, all of this depends very closely on what he called these supply elasticities. That is, you have to have responses in terms of increasing output and employment and the form that those elasticities take. This is something of I won't say an unknown factor, but if you look at most of the development theories that are based on Keynes theory, almost all of them are micro theories. That is, micro theories in the sense that they look at the response of individuals to changes in incentives. And this is this business of supply elasticities, demand elasticities, price elasticities. These are things which are crucially important to looking at the changes in overall expenditure and overall policies.
Thank you. Professor Kregel, thank you so much for this very interesting and detailed lecture. It's made all of us think. Our student group particularly, we've started with lectures, and Keynes has been quite important in the last 3-4 days. So let's take this forward. Thank you so much on behalf of all of us here. For the others, the non-student group who've joined us for this lecture online, I would like to thank you for your support and for having joined us for this lecture. We invite you to come time and again for lectures and discussions that we open to a larger audience. Yeah. I would like to especially thank Professor Eric Reinhardt, who is a great support, who joins us and who actively participates. Professor Reinhardt will come for his lecture very soon, 20th of this month. So we look forward to your lecture. Yeah. Thank you so much. And yeah, see you until next time.
Okay, best of luck with the new program, with the new year of the program that way.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Prof. Bye.
Bye, Prof. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
A little more chai and something.
Thank you. Bye.
From